Okay, this is to inmendham, aka doom gloom boom, aka do not God, Gary, etc., and also to any other viewer. I think that I have reached a major milestone in my comprehension of your philosophy, Gary. And I misapprehend. One reason I feel so sure about this is that I see how I've misapprehended a point. Now, I think the point that I made is valid in the sphere that it applies. It's just that it's over here, and Gary, you're looking over here, and that's fine. I'm trying to see where you're looking. I'm going to look over there too and make a comment about that. So by comprehension, I think I've located what you're thinking about. What's got you going so much in this social theory as it applies to suffering versus pleasure. Okay. Well, first of all, the word objective is a big block for us, but let's just talk about value for a second. I've realized that, loosely speaking at least, you admit there is subjective, we might have to call it, but some sort of value to suffering and pleasure as well, but subjective. And the issue is that it is a question of not what I would call objective, but you call it objective, what I would call material. What is the material component? So it's like this. If you define the numbers, 3 apples, and you define numbers, look, I've got 3 apples. There's a material component of the number 3 when you have 3 of the thing you're counting. So there'll be a material component. But if you have negative 3 apples, there's an immaterial part to that. Okay, so only the positive 3 is material. The negative 3 is immaterial, and while it's important, if you leave an exchange with negative 3 apples, what does that mean material? There, you don't possess any material or energy. It's a goodwill. It's a human thing. If you have negative 3 apples, it means you owe someone 3 apples from your future. You may not repay that debt because you might die. There might not be any apples, etc. Okay. Similarly, what you have seen with suffering, or the grain of truth that I'm thinking I tend to agree with, is that there tends to be a material component to the suffering, whereas the pleasure is more immaterial, more like negative numbers, more like a promise that you're not going to be suffering from now until some future point. Okay, a promise that can be broken. You can, even after the fact with the pleasure, realize, oh wait, that person wasn't really having fun, they were just fooling with me, and the pleasure becomes a misery. The material component, in other words, tends to weigh up. Now, I do believe that the pleasure is still, an opposite of the suffering that you do. And therefore, it does have a reality, just like negative numbers do. And if you have a pleasure that reduces your suffering, okay, that's a material because it's changed your suffering and lessened it. And that's why you say the pleasure can at most be material up to the zero neutral point. Okay, beyond that, it's another issue. So now I have emphasized, and where I've misapprehended perhaps, is an individualistic version of this. Like I talk about, let's say you go on your lifelong dream to go on an exploration of Africa. So you go, but you get malaria and you're sick for a month and you're totally miserable and you don't know if you're even going to make it, and you're way out in the bush and you just have to rely on this miserable luck of surviving it or not. But you do. And you keep going, and sure enough, you hike along the Congo, and you find the lost temple of the Congo. And in the end, that misery of the what did I say that you had? Well, malaria is even a good story. It becomes even a part of the pleasure of the whole thing. Okay. And the point to me is, okay, of course you can suffer that misery, and it's part of a bigger pleasure where even the misery starts to get sort of shine. Like, not just anybody does this. I had to do hardships to do it, and there's this sort of, it's a trade-off, and you can have a net positive is what I've been saying. But as I said, that's the misapprehension, because we're talking social theory. So it's reasonable for you to be saying, no. You haven't, I don't think you specifically said this, but this is where I'm thinking I'm getting what you're trying to say, or what you have been saying in your own words, which is that we're talking about your pleasures create someone else's misery. Like, where'd the guy get the camping equipment to go on this trip? Oh, he bought it. It's manufactured in China. He's relying on the slave labor. If he didn't, he couldn't have afforded to go. So that pleasure is on the backs of people working in a factory for slave labor to put together his cheap backpack and whatnot, right? So, and that's not fair because they have a material, loss, a material component to their suffering. And where's the material component of, wow, I went to Africa and I saw a really cool place? Where's the material component of that? It's sort of lacking. You can argue for one, but it's sort of in the wispy area of how material is that compared to somebody that's in a working camp type environment and is materially suffering due to it. And so that trade-off can never be made. You could have a billion units of this pleasure, and if you've caused 1 unit of material, then there is not a billion units of material on the pleasure side, so it doesn't add up, and it's especially unfair, right? Okay, so what this breaks down to then, and what we would discuss if this is at all, if you can see it all, I mean, I might have gotten it right and put it in the wrong language as well, but if you do see what I'm talking about, or anybody that does, this brings the conversation, I think, to this issue of does one person's pleasure always cause another person's suffering? Is there a way to get pleasure without causing other people suffering? And that's an interesting point to me, because I think it is possible, and maybe this is where we'll disagree again, or not, I don't know. But I think it is possible. And you say, oh, humans can't really make the universe good, which is true, but they can kind of clean up and do things better. Exactly. And so how is that, would that not be winning if we did that? If we learn to enjoy the pleasures that don't cause other people suffering, and that's why when you call art bullshit, doing art, producing it, forget the watching of it and entertainment. That's another issue. But when you produce art and you actually enjoy producing it, I know you paint stuff sometimes, so I know you have a first-hand experience of what I'm talking about. It may be bullshit in the end, right? In some sense. Of course, all art is sort of bullshit. But the part that isn't bullshit is that you got a pleasure and you didn't cause anybody else material suffering. Because the most you could do is create an image, but it's all focused in this image, which makes someone sad. And the component of that suffering, the material component, would be minimal, okay? And so this is where I use the word material, because we have suffering that you don't want to call objective suffering, and so it's material. It's how much real world component is there to that suffering. You're really upset and sad because of the color on your Maserati. What's the real world component compared to you're really sad because you're hungry as hell and you haven't eaten in 4 days? Which one is more material? I think it's pretty straightforward to look at, well, the physical components of not having food versus the wrong color paint. You can compare those for size and shape. So how would human beings not be winning if we went to enjoying things more in this artistic way? I will say as a final thing, I think one kind of suffering, that it's questionable what the material component is, but is of love, right? Love, the suffering of love. People will suffer. They'll fall in love and have the pleasure of that, and that does often lead to somebody else doesn't get what they want. They lose the person, okay? It can even have a material component. If a relationship is broken up, because there's material components to relationships. If a spouse is stolen away or whatever, decides to leave, however you want to phrase it, there is a material ramification on the person that's left behind, and the suffering that might happen. They lose their house, they don't have another house, and become homeless, is material. I don't see how we're going to get away from that exactly, but I do think we could still get a principle that even in our, in our love affairs, we try to have no material component of suffering on the other person. They're upset, they're sad, they want that person, fine, but the material component we'll all try to minimize, right, as much as we can. And as far as any other kinds of enjoying other people's suffering directly, that just all has to be gotten rid of. That's just all there is to that. If your pleasure comes from the material component of other people's suffering, or even non-materially, but just their feeling of suffering, then this is what we're trying to eradicate. And so maybe that's the debate, is can people subsist off of pleasures that don't cause other people to suffer? Cheers.